alive.
What if the employees you need live in Portugal or India or the Netherlands? Hiring internationally brings international challenges. Remote takes care of payroll, benefits, taxes, and compliance for your whole team all over the world, so you can focus on growing your business.
Welcome back to day 2 of Running Remote Online. My name is Danny Page. A big thanks to remote.com. Our lead partner here for this 2-day online event. Remote helps growing businesses employ top talent from around the world. Payroll, benefits, taxes, and compliance, they handle it all and allow companies to access and empower a global workforce no matter where they operate. Attendees, remember, receive a month free on their first hire. This is going to be quite a conversation. I know we have a significant audience, and the topic is how to get funded as a remote company. I'll welcome the gentlemen in. Marvin Liao, a partner at Game Groove Capital, Andreas Klinger, founder at Remote First Capital, and Joop van der Voort, the CEO, once again, of remote.com. Gentlemen, we are all excited to hear what you have to say today. I know there are plenty of founders and budding founders in the audience. So Marvin, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Danny. Thank you very much. Hey, everyone. I'm very, very excited to be here. I'm very excited to be moderating and hopefully participating in this panel with this very esteemed group of folks. And so I'm going to introduce myself very quickly, and then maybe what I could do, Andreas, Joop, I'll have you introduce yourselves and just sort of give a quick background, sort of context. And so I'm very, very lucky to have Andreas. He was a founder, co-founder of Product Hunt, as well as running remote at Product Hunt. And he also has an angel fund named Remote First. And Joop runs remote.com, I believe. And they just recently raised a massive round, which is great to have him here. And so you're going to get a founder perspective as well as investor perspective. Myself, I'm Marvin. Actually used to be a partner of 500 startups. Invested about 400 early stage seed companies. And now I work actually at a gaming focused the angel sort of like fund done by mainly backed by a family office out of CE region. And we're remote too, so investing in game companies, and have been in Silicon Valley now 21 years. And so honored to be here. So I'll kick it off to the guys. Andy.
Hey, how you doing? Yeah, so like Marvin gave like the perfect introduction already. Was founding team at Product Hunt. I worked at AngelList. I know Marvin since like more than I like to admit. But as a founder, like he invested in one of my companies back in the days. And now I'm running a small fund, which is called Remote First Capital. We primarily invest in either tools that improve remote work or companies that leverage remote work in a unique way. I primarily focus around second-degree effects of remote work. So what happens if more people work remote, if global work is a normal thing, if all this kind of stuff becomes a reality, what kind of companies should exist? And that's usually what I focus on in investing.
Right.
I'm Joop, as Marvin already said. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Remote. Before this, I was at GitLab, where I joined the team early on at its founding. And what I saw at GitLab was, working remotely and building a distributed team is just a massive advantage to everybody involved, for the organization, for all the individuals. And so I figured whatever I'm doing next, I have to make sure more organizations can work this way. And so I founded Remote, just to solve the biggest problem that we faced at GitLab, which is, you want to hire someone in a different country, but how do you actually pay them and make sure that, they can get paid and that it's all legal and fully compliant. And so, yeah, that's what we've been doing now for a year and a half.
All right, very good. And so what I'll do is I'm going to start off with a quote, right, to sort of set the tone for the rest of the panel. And so I stole this from a guy named Pierre Entremont. He's a co-founder partner of First. And he said, COVID-19 will be, for remote collaboration, what the first iPhone and the App Store were for thousands of new companies to be created, which I think is relevant for your company. Exciting. And so a lot has changed in the last 3 months. How is this, like what changes have you seen in your businesses, Andreas, from you investing, and also Joop from like even just you're launching just a couple months ago, right? Like officially launching, like what have you seen, sort of trajectory wise for your businesses or significant things that could be interesting for the audience?
So I would start if it's okay. Like the most interesting shift I have seen lately is actually the fact that Silicon Valley institutions take global startups more serious now. Like it used to be almost impossible to get a phone call with a San Francisco investor unless you happen to have like a San Francisco region telephone number almost, and this changed a lot over the last years. And now we're at the point that YC runs a remote batch. Beyond Deck is fully remote. First Round Capital has like remote offers and so on and so on. And it's got completely normal to jump on Zoom calls with people who are not based in the Bay Area or not based in New York. And I think this globalization of venture capital, which happened before, but was never like really a thing, or was not that extremely a thing in San Francisco before, from my point of view at least. I think that's the most positive and the most impactful change I've noticed.
Okay.
I think so. For us, we started onboarding customers a few months ago, and so we've not been able to see a before and after, because for us we were operating mostly in the after. But we did get a lot more attention now that everybody's working remote. They were like, see what's happening at remote.com. So, if you think about investors, I probably spoke with every big investor in the world at least once. And if I haven't spoken with them, they are in my email box, I guess, since the beginning of the pandemic. So it's been, we got a lot of attention. Internal in the company, I think, it's changed a lot. Yes, we are working remotely, and that hasn't changed. And like for most people, the location where they do their work hasn't changed. But it's great to be able to meet up in person and to do things outside of your house. So even though, for sure, this is paving the way for a greater future for remote work, it's also, this is not how we like to work remotely.
Right. And have you guys seen anything sort of like any changes, at least, and I can give you my perspective, but any views on sort of like how the Andres, you mentioned about the fact that now the sort of like the playing field is a little bit more leveled now, right? Because like everyone's doing Zoom calls, whether you're in San Francisco or like from abroad. So at that level, that's good. What do you think the perception and view of investors of sort of like investing in remote companies has changed? I would hope that it would, and I can give you my view, but love to get your take as well too.
Yeah, I would love to hear you, Luis. Like my personal take on it is, it used to be a given rule that everybody has to be in San Francisco, founders, team, everybody. Then at some point in the last years, it became more normal that you had an engineering team maybe outside of San Francisco. So like Eastern Europe was a very common one. Now it became normal that you have your remote team in the different locations and maybe even fully remote. I think that became normal. It's still somehow expected sometimes that the founders are in the Bay Area if you're invested in the Bay Area. But other than that, this became okay. Like I remember back then when we started Product Hunt, this was not okay. We had our first investment, and people, like a friend of mine approached me and was like, hey, you have now money and you're getting an office in San Francisco. Like you will finally get everybody over and become a real company. You know what I mean? And that has changed. That perception that this is the norm has changed, in my opinion.
How about you, Joop?
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking about the early days at GitLab. So, GitLab, the company, was founded in 2013, 2014. And a year later or so, we raised a round. And I remember that investors were extremely skeptical. And they were like, the remote thing that you're doing is fine. But like, if it doesn't work out, you're going to get a big office in San Francisco, right? Like that's the path to go. And we were not particularly... our attitude was like, well, if we must, we must, right? Like we didn't make it a make or break kind of thing. And now what I see, I spoke with a lot of investors over the past year, and almost universally they've said, well, we believe this remote thing can work. And especially, of course, in the last few months, the attitude has shifted to, why would you get an office? It is very expensive, and I would love for you to not get an office and to hire anywhere in the world. I think they're starting to see what to us were obvious benefits, right? And I think they're starting to see that.
I feel like it's almost considered anti-fragile right now. Like you're a little bit more flexible if stuff like happens, like in extreme cases. You're a little bit more flexible when it comes to hiring. You're a little bit more cash efficient, and so on and so on. So like it's almost considered anti-fragile right now. So I think that's an interesting shift. That being said, you have to have momentum. Like if you don't have momentum, it's still like the truth in startups is, if you're successful, whatever you do whatever you do. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that hasn't changed.
And I think there's enough successful sort of like remote companies where like there's processes, you know how to do it now. And you're like, well, those guys do that, right? Like GitLab being one example where I'm like, they're worth several billion now. And just like, well, they're clearly something's working, right? And they didn't actually sort of like run into any problems, especially with COVID compared to a lot of other companies. I'll give you my take. So, as normal, sort of like founders end up leading investors. And so a lot of the founders I was meeting last year, right? Like, the hype of I would argue the bubble in Silicon Valley, like a lot of the founders I was meeting were like, literally their plan would be, I'm going to come to San Francisco. I'm going to meet as many folks as I can. I'm going to raise money. And then I'm just going to take my team and go fully remote afterwards. Like that was like, I probably talked to in like November and December where like there's 25 companies I talked where like that was a plan. And it made sense, right? San Francisco is kind of a crap hole and really dirty and really expensive. So, and also just like, it just made sense. And so I actually think like my view on sort of like San Francisco is like, I think San Francisco, like in the next like 5 to 10 years, is going to become more like Wall Street, right? You come here for the network and the money, and then you leave after, right? You go and you go sort of like go hang out, check out the places, build your network, and then you leave. And I think that will become much more standard going forward, at least more of a standard operator. At least that's my take.
I agree. Like I personally like living here, but it has a little bit of the feel of the Wall Street feel, like a university, like you're part of a certain cohort, and then at some point you move on, and then you later come back like the same way as you come back to your parents and ask for more money. It feels like it's becoming that. It could be becoming that. Let's see.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where I think it'll definitely be very, very interesting on sort of like where things develop, because I think everything you said, right? Like the reality is that I think there's always going to be a lot of the big companies. Like if you have a big campus, I've heard Google and, Google's trying to force people back to the campuses like in Q4, and same thing. There's a whole another set of like companies like Twitter and, like Square, among other companies, like very, very well-known companies, are like, just going to go remote. And so it's going to be interesting, but I have a hard time thinking Salesforce, like seeing Salesforce or Google, for that to happen, right? And even Facebook to some extent. So I'm curious to sort of.
The question is, does it have to happen with those companies? Like almost all, I would say, like knowledge management techniques are kind of like generationally passed on. Like Google learned from Intel, like from Microsoft. Microsoft learned from Intel, and so on and so on. And then Facebook learned from Google, and this kind of like they learn from each other, but they do stuff different. But it doesn't mean that Microsoft like managed to take all those learnings that Google had, and like reapply them and like change themselves, what I mean? So there's a high chance that those companies might have stayed the way they are, and there's a certain cultural inertia around a new generation of tech companies.
Yeah, and I think what's going to be interesting is sort of like, as we've had a lot of layoffs, I think a lot of these companies, a lot of these folks who've recently been laid off, like why I'm very, very bullish, I think, about sort of like Silicon Valley still, is that you're seeing a bunch of layoffs. A lot of these folks are going to start companies. These are folks coming from like amazing companies like Uber and Airbnb and Lyft or whatever, like highly entrepreneurial. There is going to be a whole new wave of really interesting companies. And a lot of them, a default is going to be thinking like I've talked to a bunch of them. The default seems to be like, we're just going to build it wherever we've like some, either some college town in like, somewhere else in the US or something like that. And what are your views on sort of like, the last sort of 3 months? So this is what's changed in the business. Have you seen any sort of like changes, at least from an investment side, right? Because this is supposed to be sort of like investment panel or discussing sort of fundraising. What have you seen on the fundraising side for both sides? So, you just raised 11 million, right? 11 million recently. And just to maybe this would be helpful for everybody, because there's been a bunch of announcements of companies where they've just like, hey, like we just raised like 5 million or 10 million, 11. But I think it's sometimes good to give them the context. I'm like, when did you actually like close a round, and when did you actually announce it?
Yeah, so we announced it on April 22nd, and like the actual close was exactly 1 month before that. So
March.
You get a closing date, and you're like, okay, we're gonna announce it like a month later, and then get everything in order. And I think the deal for us was the actual deal was done really, really quickly, because we were very clear about who we wanted on the cap table and who we didn't want. But the reality is that like the conversations leading up to it, they cost months, right? Like, so I think I was talking with many of the investors for months, if not years, already while I was working at GitLab, about doing something, about the potential of doing something. So those conversations went on for a very long time, and it took a long while, I guess, to build up momentum. And then once you decide to say, well, okay, we are actually going to raise money now, then it is much easier to, to switch that.
When did you actually start so you had conversations sort of like, even like last year, when did you actually like start the, hey, we're fundraising, and then sort of like, when did you close it, just so folks have an idea?
Yeah, so I was in November last year. I was in San Francisco. I met Andreas, I think in person for the first time, even though we know each other for a while, and a bunch of other people. And there I visited one of our investors, who's not a board member, Willy. And I just went to visit him because we knew each other, we worked together, and it was like, well, I'm around, so like, let's meet up. And then we came to the topic, and I was like, yeah, we're considering raising money. We're not sure. We're considering raising money. And he was very excited at the time. And so that was like the start of those conversations, and like leaning into a little bit more. And I happened to speak with a bunch more investors there, and like those conversations eventually resulted in me saying, having to say at one point, like, okay, yeah, we are actually raising. I have an idea of how much like we can raise and how much we can do given the current circumstances. And then we ended up pulling the trigger eventually. Like it was a matter of weeks that it took from like, yes, we're doing this. This is the total amount that we're raising. This is a term sheet we're going with, and then this is how we execute it.
And was that, yeah. Yes, Andres.
You must have seen this multiple hundred times, but like the reality of fundraising is it's unfortunately too easy to start fundraising, but it's really hard to close fundraising. And it's kind of like to get to this critical momentum that you actually are able to close a fundraising. Yeah. Like what a lot of startups are doing, basically they're like not fundraising, but kind of discussions, what I mean? Until they have the critical momentum that they know they can close. Sometimes they even take a few saves along that way. That just like get a few people to commit, like we're not fundraising, but we would like to have you as like a strategic blah, 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 and to actually get to this critical momentum before they announce that they're fundraising, because the only way to get, in my experience, to get bigger VCs to actually close on a deal is to make them understand it will close either with them or not.
Yeah, it's the FOMO. You gotta drive the FOMO, right? And that's why you talk to a lot of different people, and you talk to them in a very compact amount of time, right? And then you flip the switch when you're like, okay, I'm ready to go, and then you have some commitments, and then it just becomes like a rolling snowball, right? But you have to do that, and it has to be very compressed. Because if you're spreading out over a long period of time, like you're kind of wasting your time. But I do think there's different, how you raise as an early stage company versus how you raise as like Series A, Series B is very, very different, right? And so I'm a little bit more familiar with the pre-seed and seed. And I guess for both of you, what tips would you have for folks who are like looking to fundraise right now, right? Like what should they know now that sort of like seems like I joke of sort of like you saw that Onion article. It talked about like, this city is in like stage 4, pretending COVID-19 hasn't happened, right? And the pandemic's over. So just like, it seems like what sort of things are opening up now. I'm curious of sort of like, what are you like what tips do you think you have for folks who like now seems like things are unlocking and, at least from the fundraising side?
I think a lot of investors are agreeing that there's now a new market, right? We went from a world where remote tools and such were great and useful, but they were not very serious, to a world where Zoom makes a quarter of hundreds of millions. Like and so for a lot of startups, this is an enormous opportunity. And so if you are doing something, or you can pivot, or you can show it in a light that shows that, look, we are riding this wave of like the transformation of work, that can be incredibly positive. And I think that's what all investors are looking for now, right? I think no matter what happens, we're going to end up in a situation where way more people are working remotely, if only part-time, than before this. And so there's a massive opportunity to get that, and to jump on that, and to provide tools, to provide infrastructure, and anything else, and services to help with that. So if you are doing something in that space, like just put yourself in a narrative and like make it clear why are you essential, and like try to ride that wave. And if you are not, right, then that's a tricky place to be, I would say.
Yeah, you're either a COVID beneficiary or you're not, right? And there are some very clear, like telehealth, like going like crazy, right? Like anything e-commerce related, anything that enables remote work or digitization of work, ed technology. Like I have a young daughter, and just like I don't think they're going back to school this year. Like I think it's gonna be video, right? And doing it on Zoom doesn't really work that well. So like, you know, what happens there?
The way that I personally think about this is, so I wouldn't think too much about COVID. I would rather think about like the meta narrative here personally. It's like replace the word remote with like online or with global, you know, and you come up with a lot of ideas. If you only think of like remote work as an area for looking for good ideas or like how to pivot your companies, what you end up to do is like the same thing as like engineers that want to build an application. So they have no idea what they should do. So they start with a to-do list app because they're really bad in like organizing ideas. Then they do like a budget tracker. Then they do like a project management tool, you know, then they do a note-taking app. It's like the obvious, if you look at remote work and you try to fix the obvious problems, you end up with like yet another communication tool. And there's a lot of them right now. Yep. I invested in 22 companies around remote work and none of them is a communication tool. So there's a lot of stuff around the, I would say, second degree effect or meta narrative by just having more people being globally online and being able to leverage that in multiple ways. And for example, education, as you mentioned, like I invested in a global online school that is literally like not homeschooling, but like an online school for kids, you know. And there will be like a lot more like this in the near future because we're not going to use the internet less. We're not going to work with less global teams. We're not going to work less on our computers, you know, that will just be a trend that goes upward and continue. So I believe there's a lot of second degree effects possible around like globalization or like remote work.
Yeah. And that, I think that's sort of what investors are looking for is like, you know, for you as a founder, is just like, what is the insight that you have about this either newly developed market or this market that's going to shift, right? And, you know, as investors, we're looking for you to bring that to us because we know stuff, but we don't know that much stuff, right? The insight's usually driven by the founders, not driven by, you know, we're almost always founder led into sort of like these businesses, right? Like we might have ideas, like you said, the overall meta where like, oh, ed tech makes a lot of sense, but we don't know the specific stuff. And so that's something that I think as investors, we definitely look for from founders and you should have a view on that, right? Like I hope you have a view or else I don't know why you're working on a company.
There's also like right now this interesting moment where the user base online is just so big, like so many customers are online that you can do a lot of very, very successful businesses that are complete niches. And that might not even be a typical venture case. And like right now, there's like you can literally build plugins for Shopify and become a millionaire with no problem, you know? You can build the most niche thing that I couldn't even come up here and easily become like a very successful business through that. And so like we currently are a little bit primed to look for like what are good VC cases, you know, like what are good cases that are like investors would be interested in. Right now it's also like a very good moment just to do businesses that make money and scale them up globally.
Yeah, niches, you know, I think this is something that folks don't really understand is that even though the niche looks very, very small, just because of just the continual numbers of people coming online, like it's an amazing, amazing time to be a startup founder right now. Just like the opportunities. And this is something I tell any founder, just like I stole this from my friend, Zach Colias, or just like we were chatting on a panel and he said like, you know, it's scary, like sort of what's happened in the last like 3-4 months of the pandemic and everything that's going on. But it's also incredibly exciting because if you think about a lot of companies prior to COVID, like say March, like a lot of companies that had product market fit prior, like they don't have product market fit anymore, right? Like Uber does not have product market fit anymore. But the reverse has happened. A bunch of companies that did not have product market fit all of a sudden have just like all of a sudden this huge new market. And so telehealth has had one example where like there's a telehealth company where like they've literally hit their 2020 forecast just in March, right? Just because of the spike of business. And so it's a very interesting time where like there's a completely huge new market out there now. And it's a great time to start a company because a lot of great talents also being dislodged from a lot of big companies as they lay off folks. And so there's a great way to, you know, like it's a great time to go and pick up talent too.
Also,
yeah, I think an interesting thing that is happening is that When we used to be talking about the remote work ecosystem, it was all small companies, like startup companies, like new tech companies. One thing that is now happening is that, like, independent of the size of the organization, they're forced to work remotely. So these giant enterprises that were previously very stuck to their ways, and everybody has to, be at the office, be in a suit, all those organizations are now also fully working remotely. So it's not just, that we need the little tools and the things that serve typical tech teams. Is you can now build a company, just target very large enterprises and be extremely successful, even if it's around, managing documentation, which is a big problem in those organizations where, the default is to print every email that you get in.
Yeah, it's crazy times. Andreas, you're saying?
One interesting angle is also like we have a lot of areas where there's kind of like a definite winner, like a startup that made the market, but a lot of those startups right now, even if they launched like 5 to 10 years ago, a lot of those startups currently struggle a lot to adapt to the current like changes in their own company, and they're so obsessed with like their own internal problems that right now is a good moment to just become like a competitor to them and like rethink what is like the core of what they do and just like build a good competitor for them. And there's also a lot of angles where you can just take fresh views on it. So for example, I'm a strong believer that there will have a huge generation of service-oriented SaaS products that have like concierge experiences in it. Like in a lot of tools, you hire like a virtual PA to actually do the work for you because you don't have the time. And that's actually a missing functionality in that tool in a lot of cases. A good example for that is like Americans might notice is like TurboTax, where you have an actual CPA in the tool helping you and guiding you through. That kind of thing I could imagine for almost every kind of SaaS company in the near future, And so I believe there's like multiple angles to attack current, like this market is done winners. So yeah, it's a very interesting time right now.
Yeah, it's like a great reset, right? It's like that Cambrian explosion of like new interesting companies, and because of the shift, right? Like somebody told me about just like I have a bunch of friends who work at big companies and now forced to work remote. Like they have to rethink everything. Like they've been able to push through big sort of like digitization sort of like projects where before like they'd made zero progress, nobody really cared about, their bosses didn't want, just like it's just a very challenge the last 5 years. They've gotten more done in the last like 2-3 months than they've done in the last like 5 years of digitization because they're forced to. And I anticipate that's probably going to continue because they start seeing the cost savings and the efficiency benefits as well too for a lot of this stuff. I don't think it's going away, right? Like I think that's sort of, I think we all agree here. We're just like, I don't think remote's like going away, and it's actually probably only going to accelerate. And so, like I think it's an exciting time to sort of like be a startup in this space. And so I think we have like 3 minutes before we sort of open it up for questions. Any tips for founders who are going through fundraising on Zoom right now?
I would say it's not different. The same things that apply to the real life apply to Zoom, which means that like take care of yourself, take breaks, present yourself in the best possible way. Make sure that you do it. If you go to a VC's office, what you do is you make sure you're showered, you have clean clothes on, you're well prepared. If you have a Zoom, like, just do the same things. Like it gives you an edge. Make sure you're in a quiet place. Make sure you have like stable internet. Don't call with your phone. That's such a basic thing that so many people get wrong.
That's true.
You'd be surprised.
It is true.
Call with a friend like an hour before just to check your audio and video. So you are like probably the other party, which happens in like half of your Zoom calls, if not more. They're gonna have problems, but you don't want to be the one that's like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't get my audio to work, and you start emailing each other. I've had several meetings like that where the other party started emailing me, I can't get in, something is wrong. That's a pretty basic beginning. Other than that, I think now is the time. Now is the time, especially if you were not able to get to San Francisco. You were nowhere near, it was too far, or you couldn't get a visa, which are reasons for a lot of people in the world that if you're in San Francisco, it may be hard to imagine, but like many people like are unable to get there. So now is the time to make sure, because there's no difference between a founder that's now in an apartment like Andreas in San Francisco and you, wherever you are in the world. So now is the time to get those calls, and everybody is at the same distance online.
There's one
Great
huge
tip.
difference. I pay like 3 times the rent, if not 4 times.
Yeah, for sure.
most likely 10 times. And like I will add like also like one super small thing here, you know, and we can talk about like fundamental strategies, but like one super small thing. If you compare our 3 different camera setup, okay, we go from person who just went up and is looking downwards from to a laptop, you know, to person who tried to put a laptop at least on some podcast, you know, and to person who has actually a professional camera that and looks like this is casual for him. You know, I've been to calls where it looked like a proper TV ad instantly.
Yeah, I can do this. I can turn on the lights and such for him.
Yeah, you see. So anyway, this is like it. As weird as it sounds, like this is a small thing, but this makes a huge difference because you're more professional, you know. And there's obviously like a lot of more fundamental truths about fundraising. I think the most important one here is go for warm introductions. Like I believe that public deal flow is like really like for most VCs it's almost a lie. Yeah, it's almost a lie. Like they have a form, like even I have a form public on my fund page. And even for me, it's hard to like just answer to all of them, you know what I mean? So, and I'm like one of the smallest fund you will ever pitch, hopefully, you know? So go for warm introductions. And the best way to do this, in my opinion, is approach first people as potential, like just to give you feedback, like advisors. Don't instantly start for looking for like investors. Start looking for founders who work in similar fields, you know? And those, if they are successful, know the investors and can give you like a very good introduction if you're like in the right stage.
And I would argue in this environment, warm intros probably matter more. The other advice I give most founders investing in sort of in the Zoom, in sort of this new Zoom environment, just like due diligence is going to take longer than you think because like a lot of folks are used to sort of like meeting folks. I think like in later stage that still hasn't unlocked. I think in earlier stage people are getting like in like a lot of pre-seed and seed, they're getting used to sort of like writing checks. There's are a lot of checks being written right now, but I do think that there is a comfort level just like meeting face to face that you don't necessarily have with Zoom. So they're like just expect what maybe would take like 2 or 3 live meetings, or maybe 1 or 2 live meetings would probably be like 4 or 5 Zoom calls, right? And I think that's a good way to sort of like think about, you just might have to, it might take a little bit longer and you might have to sort of go through a couple more steps, but it's doable. So I think folks are just getting used to sort of the new regime.
Q&A.
I'll jump in, I'm back. First of all, Job in his background, like he just destroyed everyone that has ever spoken at this conference. Did he just adjust the lights in the background? Wow. If you're fundraising, that's the first thing.
He can also change the light of his room. Like, don't even like get him started, you know?
Yeah, there's a lot of tricks that I have here. It's
wow.
Shameful.
You should do a blog post on that, man. You should do a blog post and with recommendations.
Yeah, I'm slightly embarrassed with the amount of stuff I have here, the amount of money I put into the setup. But yeah,
you should be proud to say the least.
You should focus on like subconscious stuff, you know, like just like make your head a little bit brighter and like the background like glowing when you say something dramatic, you know what I mean? Like very subconsciously.
Right. It like the lights change with his tonality, you know, maybe put an orchestra on the side, right when you make the pitch. We have a few questions that have come in, guys. Vince Lamontia says, what metrics do you need to see to feel comfortable in investing in an all remote company? Do you have productivity concerns or any others along those lines?
Mm-hmm. Marvin, you want to start?
No, I don't care about the product. Like if you're delivering on the numbers, like you have great user numbers, you have great sort of like revenue numbers, it's up to the right, good engagement numbers. Like I don't, you know, like that doesn't really matter. That wouldn't matter. Like outside.
Did it matter to you like 3 or 4 years ago? You know, in the 500 startup days? No.
So yeah, like my take on this is I usually look at deals from like 3 different angles, like innovation, execution, and credentials. Innovation is kind of like, is this something similar as something that exists or something fundamentally new? Execution is like how much progress did they made, and credential is like who brings in the deal, what is the founder background, investors. The later the company stage, the more obviously you need to prove more execution. You can get a lot of like I would say clout by just having something unique that nobody has tried yet, you know, and like on being an innovation scale, that's fine, you know, and then by that you don't have to have that much of execution proof yet. But if you're doing something similar to other companies, you have to prove more execution. So what could be execution, you know, and it's kind of like unique to each company. Like ideally it's money, profit, revenue, but it can be like whatever your current traction means, you know, it just has to be something meaningful to your business.
Yeah.
You know, I want to ask a bit of a follow-up question. It's a personal question as well, which is we always talk about more trust in companies, more trust in teams with remote work, right? But if a capital group is investing in a company, they have to have more trust in the founders as well, right? Like, is there an increased trust in that dynamic additionally?
I wouldn't be sure about that. I mean, like, I think the thing about an organization is that you're always around each other in an office, right? And that's no longer the case. So you can't rely on seeing each other anymore. And I mean, I've heard many stories about investors stepping into offices and then the founders want to make sure that everybody is working hard and, you know, focused at their desk. But then again, you know, in a lot of ways, this is not very different, right? Like in some ways, it's easier to reach most of the organization because everything happens online. So if they really want to, it's possibly easier. I'm not sure. I'm not the investor speaking here, so I would say
similar communication channels.
Yeah.
I'll jump to another question from Chris. Remote first was already a growing trend before the pandemic hit. Question for Andreas: has the deal flow of remote first doubled, tripled, or grown more since the pandemic has hit?
So yes and no. Like the deal flow in general has grown a lot. What happens a lot more is that I get deals from other investors. Oddly enough, many of those companies I have seen like months before already. And a thing that I don't do is I don't invest in a company that just now has like more traction because of COVID. Like if you manage to double your numbers during COVID and you're doing like a tool that's useful in times of COVID, you know, like good for you, but that doesn't just fundamentally just prove the whole product by itself, you know what I mean? So I had a lot more deal flow, yes. To be fair, I'm only doing this since quite recently, like since last year somewhere. So I don't have that much of a comparison as, for example, somebody like Marvin who has literally invested in 500 companies. So
Marvin, your perspective?
I think the reality is that I think the big burst of sort of like remote first companies, you probably only start now. I'm not sure sort of like there was a big burst sort of like, usually when you see companies sort of do well, it's usually they've been working on it for a period of time. So I'm actually anticipating a burst of like really interesting sort of like companies and remote first companies probably like about a year from now. But I haven't seen a dramatically sort of like huge jump. I've seen a lot of companies repositioning to sort of like towards their remote first, or saying they are. I don't know if they really are.
Right. And you see that too in SaaS a lot as well. Companies that, you know, they're now our perfect resource for remote work and remote tools when really they were not leveraging this before. Along those lines, Marvin, like, did you have a vision for when remote first, this is a question from the audience, that I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. Did you have a thought as to when remote first companies would be en vogue? And the audience viewer says, did you think it was going to be like 2030? What was your sort of long-term perspective?
Yeah, it was probably like 2025 and 2030. Like I'm not sure a lot of folks sort of like saw COVID coming. And so COVID has sped up a lot of that, right? So I would say where I thought it'd be more like 2030, you know, 2025 to 2030 is probably more 2020 to 2025. So it's sped up a lot of things.
My personal take on this is like, it's really, really hard to see any early stage startup that doesn't have some sort of a remote team angle nowadays, because you have some people who are not in the same office, like by default. That's like just a given norm nowadays. It's becoming more normal that this is true for like mid-sized to bigger companies. That's like a unique thing, you know? So I like one thing, for example, I do with my fund is I don't invest just into a company because they're a remote first company. For me, this is like being a company that has standing desks. You know, it's like good for the company, good for the employees, but doesn't make the team or the company or the product good, you know? So I honestly believe that remote first team setup will be the complete norm for startups going forward, just to be more anti-fragile, being able to hire better and so on, and be more flexible. Regarding tools for remote work or tools around remote work, I think it will be the same as with like mobile commerce, mobile pay, and all these other mobile prefix things. It will just become a normal thing. You won't think of them as like remote tools or remote companies. It will be just like digital knowledge tools and companies.
Super. Believe it or not, fellas, we're out of time here. We really appreciate your perspective. Joop, did you have a final thought? Did you have something you wanted to jump in with there?
Yes, become a customer of Remote. That's it.
Yeah, we really
we're a
Always
startup. I
Always
have to
selling,
do my
man.
work.
Always
Totally.
selling. That's good.
Absolutely.
It's
Oh wait, I
And
can
seriously,
quickly turn on the lights and then move my desk up.
someone actually wrote a comment that said, "No, seriously, what is your video setup? We've invested a lot of money in ours, and it nowhere near compares." So
We will post a blog post on our blog
Right.
Seriously.
next week.
Seriously. Yeah,
Right.
seriously.
Perfect. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your perspective. This has been so insightful. We really appreciate it.
Right.
Thanks for having
Thanks,
us.
guys.
Everyone.
We will take we will take a break here, a lunch break. I think that's why I'm so excited. There are a couple upcoming demos, one from Serviapp, who is one of our partners, and then Flex Jobs as well. Make sure to, if you're here on the West Coast, it's lunchtime, but make sure to come back at 1 o'clock. Winning the Talent War with Remote Working, Tim Minahan, the Chief Marketing Officer at Citrix. They have been in this industry for a long time, and we're looking forward to speaking to Tim later on. Fellas, all the best. Take care.
Thank you. Take care, guys.